everyone! Today is January 31st. Tomorrow marks the beginning, the official kickoff of the Octafinals for the BookTube Prize. It's crazy to think that we've already come full circle. Last year was my first year participating, reading for nonfiction. I'm doing the same thing again this year. So I have been assigned a group. I wanted to do a bit of an intro to let you know what I'm reading, and then I'll do exactly what I did last year, where I'll just put in clips of me as I finish the books and end with a big wrap up. If you're looking for a particular review, I will put timestamps down below so you can click those if you don't want to hear about every single book. If you have stumbled across this video and you're wondering what the BookTube Prize is, I will link the season 3 kickoff video down below so you can go understand how the rules for this work. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue on like you know what I'm talking about. This year, the original list for nonfiction was over 100 books long. I imagine the fiction list was the same, but since I only read for nonfiction, I don't see that one. And I chose my top 20, and of the 48 that made it to the long list, 12 of the books I originally voted for made it in, which I'm not sure how that compares to other people. Last year I didn't even figure out what I had voted for versus what actually made it in. This year I wanted to keep track. So if you also do that, I'd be curious to know how many of your votes made it into the top 48. 2 of my runner-ups also made it in, books that I didn't end up picking as my top 20, but were like that next 5 that I was debating between. The group that I was assigned for the 2021 Octafinals is Group A. I have not read any of these books. I did vote for one of them, so I'll let you know which one that is when I get there. But I just wanted to kind of go through and take a look at the 6 books I have to read, share my initial thoughts, and then go from there. The first book in Group A is Intimations by Zadie Smith. I had heard of this book before that big long list was released, and that's mostly because I saw some people haul it back in the summer when it was released. I've seen one review and it was pretty meh, so I don't exactly have high expectations for this book. It is very short. It's only 97 pages, and it's a book of essays that were written at the beginning of the coronavirus during the original lockdown, and then very quickly published in July of 2020. Part of me is intrigued to read this because we are now sitting at the end of January going into February 2021. It's almost been a full year of really experiencing the coronavirus, at least for me where I am. And so I think it'll be interesting to read what somebody was thinking a year ago when things were first starting and reflecting on what has actually happened since then. The second book I have to read is Just Us, An American Conversation by Claudia Rankine. I know of Claudia Rankine, but I've never read anything by her before, and I had not heard of this book before the long list came out, so I definitely had to do some extra digging when I saw it had been assigned to me to really understand what I was going to be reading. This one is also a book of essays, so there's a fair amount of essay books that I have to read. It says it contains poems and images, and it's more of a conversation regarding white supremacy and racism. And as far as I understand, there's going to be essays and stories shared by people from different perspectives, like a white male perspective and etc. And then Claudia's going to be kind of responding to it with footnotes and references and whatnot. The point of this seems to be to urge us to begin discussing racism, white supremacy, white privilege, and all of that. The reviews that I'm seeing on here, because I haven't seen anybody else talk about it, are generally quite positive. So although I wasn't sure what to think of this book at first, I am more interested in reading it now. For those of you that were following along with the big long nonfiction list and then the actual long list of 48 books, you'll know that there are some huge books on this list, and I was obviously slightly terrified that I was going to get one of them. I did get one of the big books in this list, but it's not the biggest book. I have to read A Promised Land by Barack Obama. This one comes in at 768 pages, approximately, depending on what edition you have. Luckily for me, my sister actually just got the audiobook on Audible, so I was like, hey, can I borrow that? Because there's no way I'd be able to get this one from the library. The holds list is probably incredibly long, and I don't really want to pay a lot of money for a big thick book, so audiobook's gonna be the way to go on this one. I'm sure many of you were aware of this book beforehand. I certainly was. It is the first of Obama's presidential memoirs, so this one follows from the beginning of his political aspirations up through the first term of his presidency. I've heard good things, just generally, so hopefully this 768 page book will be worth it. The audiobook is 29 hours. I've listened to some long audiobooks before, so I don't really have an issue with that. And hopefully I'll really like this. If I do like it, then it'll push me to read the second book when that one comes out. The fourth book was the book that I actually voted for, and this is the address book, What Street Addresses Reveal About Identity, Race, Wealth, and Power by Deirdre Mask. I love the idea of this book. I think the subtitle gives you a good idea of what it's going to cover. I often think about street names and where those street names come from and how towns and cities have different areas and what those can mean in terms of your race and your class. So I think this is going to give me some really interesting tidbits. It says it's filled with fascinating people and histories, so it sounds like I'm going to get a lot of little stories that relate back to street names and areas of cities and maybe how places are laid out, kind of urban planning. So that sounds great. So this is the one I am the most excited about. I've already got it from the library. I'm ready to go, ready to read this one, and hopefully it lives up to my expectations and my enthusiasm for it. The fifth book is World of Wonders, In Praise of Fireflies, Whale Sharks, and Other Astonishments by Aimee Nezhukumatathil. This is another collection of essays that's going to be about the natural world and the way its inhabitants can teach, support, and inspire us. Aimee is a poet, and even just the little blurb that I'm reading here, it has an excerpt from the book, and it does seem like it's going to be very lyrical and flowy and whatnot, and I'm a little worried about this one. This is the one I'm the most worried about that I won't like. It does say that it has illustrations. It says gorgeously illustrated by Fumi Nakamura, so I definitely want to get a physical copy of this because I feel like that'll add to the experience and hopefully help me like the book more. But I also am not sure if the style of this is going to be for me. This one's 165 pages, so it's not particularly long either. So even if I'm not a huge fan, there won't be too much of it to get through. The final book that I have to read for Group A is Surviving Autocracy by Masha Gessen. This is described as the ideal of the anti-Trump book. Masha is a journalist, and they have been writing about Trump since the lead up to the 2016 election. So it's very much a reflection on how quickly things can shift from feeling okay and comfortable to being in these really intense extremes, and how split the United States is at this point. An indispensable overview of the calamitous trajectory of the past few years is one of the sentences that describes this book. I think this will be very upsetting to read in a way, but when this book was published on June 2nd last year, Trump was still president at the time and the election hadn't happened, so it's still very tense at that point. Whereas now that Biden is in office, I think there will be a sense of relief with me reading this book. I know that there are so many other things that are still problems that still need to be solved. There is still that group of people that believe in Trump and what he stood for, but at least I'll be able to take a slight step back when reading this book. If Trump had been reelected and I was reading this book, it would be a different experience, I think. I hadn't heard of this book before it appeared on this list, but I'm looking forward to reading this one. Those are the 6 books that I will be reading over the next 2 months. If you want to hear my thoughts on them, just stick around. Last night, I finished The Address book, What Street Addresses Reveal About Identity, Race, Wealth, and Power by Deirdre. This was the one that I was looking forward to the most. It was the book I voted for, so my expectations were a bit higher than with all the other ones, and I feel like this book mostly met them. I was obviously hoping for a 5-star read. In the case of the BookTube Prize, I don't expect every book to be a 5-star, but because this is one that had caught my interest, the expectations were up there a bit. Some good things about this book was how it was structured. I thought the way it was broken down into sections and then subsections, which contained more specific stories, was really well laid out. For example, we have development, origins, politics, race, class, and status, which really directly relates back to the title well. And then within there's a few stories in each that sort of expand on those ideas. So I thought it was very easy to follow and understand why we were talking about this particular thing at that time. Another thing that I liked about this book was that we've got stories from many different places. The author was born in the US and now lives in the UK, so I was kind of expecting a little bit more US-UK centric, but I'm happy to say that was not the case. She had stories from India, Haiti, Japan, Korea, South Africa, and a fair amount of stories in the US and the UK as well, but I found that the spread was really good. I think my favorite section was actually the one about Korea and Japan. The subtitle for that one was Korea and Japan, Must Streets Be Named? And she got into how they're set up, or at least in Japan specifically, how things are done rather than done in streets, they're done in blocks. And then she talked about how that might relate back to the writing systems that we use, and how, like when I was taught in school, we were taught to write in between lines, and the lowercase letters only went to the middle line and the uppercase letters went to the top line. And so you're used to putting things, having it relate to this linear space, I guess you could say. But in Japan, for example, you learn to write the kanji in boxes. And so that's more like a block rather than a street. And that kind of blew my mind a little bit. I think that was the one that I had never thought about that before. It had never come up. I've never been to that region of the world, so I've never had to try and navigate there. But I feel like that would be really difficult for me to do, and for many of us to do, when our brains are so used to operating on a street name basis and not by blocks. I found the style of this book to be pretty casual, and not to say that there aren't casual nonfiction books out there, but I feel like this was definitely one of the more casual ones that I've ever read. Just the language that she was using, and she could sort of insert little anecdotes a lot, and so in that way, I think this would be a good book for someone who is not a big nonfiction reader, because it's not very dense and heavy. It doesn't drone on. There's lots of sections to kind of break things up. None of the chapters are particularly long, so I think the flow is really good. That being said, I do feel like that more casual tone sometimes fell into oversharing, telling us little tidbits about the people that we were meeting, that she was talking to or was researching, and just going too far, oversharing, giving us too much, things that weren't relevant. I think it was a little overwhelming because we were already learning so many different stories. We were hearing about a lot of different people, so I think it would have been better to cut down on the extra noise, so to say, if this had been more focused on a particular region, or really delving into one particular person and how they shaped the idea of addresses. That would be the situation where you could really dive in and give us all these little tidbits, but it was a bit much in this. Another thing that I noticed that she did is she really loves her parentheses. There were pages where there was like multiple sets of parentheses on one page, and then you'd go for a while and there wouldn't be any. So it really just depended on what she had to share, but There was definitely a lot of parentheses in here. I feel like most of the time people talk about M dashes and the overuse of M dashes. This had an overuse of parentheses. Since this is the first book that I finished, it's just gonna sit at the #1 spot until something else potentially bumps it off. It's a 4-star read. It's certainly worth your time if you're already interested in reading it, but it wasn't quite at that level that I was hoping it would be at. I have now finished Surviving Autocracy by Masha Gessen, and unfortunately this one was not so great. It's still a 3-star read because the stuff within this was still interesting and informative to some degree, but I had problems with the book. The first problem is the fact that the title does not match what is actually in here and what this actually talks about. The Surviving Autocracy title is very catchy and makes this book feel like it could apply to many different situations in the past and the future. But what this book actually looks at is the lead up to the 2016 election and then Trump's presidency up to the point that this book was written, which was about like spring 2020. It was published in June of 2020. And that also leads into another smaller issue that I have with the book. But focusing on this in the meantime, I found that there wasn't that much about actually surviving autocracy. The deep dives into choices that Trump has made, the way he and his cronies did things, how they spoke about things, how he kind of mirrored a lot of his behavior off of what Vladimir Putin does, and how he sort of looked up to certain leaders who are not the leaders you want to look up to. That was all in there, and part of me appreciated the summation that this book provided with looking at all of these bad things that Trump has done and sort of relating it to autocracy and talking about why it was bad and how these sorts of things can slowly happen over time, and before you know it, you're in a really intense situation. The author did mention how if Trump lost the election, his most ardent followers would have a very negative reaction to that, and they were right. It did, yeah, there was a very negative reaction to that on January 6th with the storming of the Capitol. This book made me mad because it reminded me of all of the horrible things that Trump has done, and it also brought some things to light that I wasn't aware of or had potentially forgotten over the years. And there was a lot of truth in everything that they were saying. I agreed with their analysis. However, there wasn't really a lot about surviving autocracy. A little bit at the end, but not enough to have that be the title of your book. The other thing that I hinted at before that I didn't really like about the book was that it was written so recently and published in June of this year, so we don't have the full play of everything that happened. Trump luckily lost the election and is no longer president of the United States, but that for this book is almost a bad thing because there's no real conclusion on that in here because of when it was published, and it feels odd reading it now from my perspective, looking back and saying, well, Trump isn't president anymore. I wish we could have some conclusion on this and sort of a more of a move forward perspective. So I feel like if this book had been published in June of 2021, that might have been good, and changed the title, of course, as well. I think it would have provided me more of that like finality and that bit of that stamp at the end of like, this is done, here's what we're gonna do, here's how we move forward. If Trump had won the election and was still president, I feel like this book would be more relevant going forward. However, it would have been even more relevant if that was the case, and if there was actually more about surviving autocracy, because it would have been even more important, because you can only imagine how much worse things would have gotten with another 4 years of him in office. My general feelings on this are meh. And so for that reason, it is definitely going to be second on the list behind the Address book. And I imagine it'll fall a bit farther because I'm almost done Obama's book, and I'm liking that a lot more than this. Despite its length, I have been much more engaged with that. So I imagine this is going to fall a little bit farther down on the list. I am also currently reading World of Wonders as an ebook from the library, which I have never done before. And then the last two books that I need to read, Intimations and Just Us, unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to get them from the library in time. They were both on order for a long time. I think because of the lockdown in Ontario, they didn't get the books as soon as they thought they would. And there's a couple people ahead of me in line, so I might have to buy them, which I'm not super thrilled about because neither of them are really the type of books that I want to spend my money on. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens. You'll find out soon enough. I've finished listening to the audiobook of A Promised Land, and I have to say that was surprisingly enjoyable. Not that I was expecting to dislike the book. I wasn't upset by the fact that I got assigned it, but I didn't know exactly where I'd fall. I could have been in that middle range of like, yeah, it was decent, but I was actually interested in listening to this for the full 29 hours and 10 minutes that it was. I never felt like I was being burdened with having to spend my time listening to it. The audiobook is definitely the way to go if you like audiobooks and are interested in listening to this book. Obama narrates it, and he's an excellent speaker, and then obviously to have his little ways that he says things because he was there, the little funny bits, the talking about what different people were saying to him, how he was reacting to things. I think you get that little extra spark because he's the one reading it. What I find interesting is that this is supposedly supposed to be a 2-volume presidential memoir thing, and this book covers a lot of ground, but also doesn't get that far into his presidency. I thought it was going to be, the first book would be about the first term, second book about the second term, but that was definitely not the case. You definitely get stuff about his childhood, about his family, and then you sort of focus on the decisions that he made, the places that he worked that eventually led him to running for president. And you are 8 hours into this audiobook, over 8 hours into it, before you actually get to the point where he wins the election. So you have 8 hours of precursor. Some of that is definitely about the run-up to the election and being on the campaign trail. But there's a lot of it that's about his time in the Illinois Senate, in the US Senate, and just go Harvard Law School, things like that. So you get a decent background, which I like because I haven't read any of his other books. I don't have in-depth knowledge of his background. I know kind of surface level stuff. I really like the small anecdotes that we've got, the details about daily life in the White House, of just living and working in that environment, hearing about his relationship with Michelle, with Sasha and Malia, and how they reacted to everything that was happening with their dad and husband becoming president of the United States. I laughed out loud a number of times reading this, sometimes from like a little snort to like a full-on laugh. And I think a lot of those times were when he was talking about his interactions with other world leaders. I found his descriptions of their personalities very interesting. I liked hearing about that. I particularly liked his descriptions of Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy and how they would interact with him and with each other, and so great. So anytime he was talking about being at a G8 summit or some sort of conference, I was looking forward to hearing what he had to say about the other world leaders. There wasn't anything in particular that I really disliked about this book, but I would say that I didn't really like hearing about the recession and all of that. It absolutely had to be in this book. It was a huge part of what was happening leading up to Obama being elected. It was a big part of the first couple of years of his presidency, so there's no way he couldn't have not talked about it. But I think for me, I'm just so freaking tired of hearing about it. There's been movies made about it. It's been analyzed to death, and it's one of those things that comes up all the time. The Great Recession, I lived through it. I just tired of hearing about it. So there were certain details that I enjoyed within that umbrella of like a lot of time spent on it, but generally I was just like, okay, I'd rather hear about other things. And we did hear about other things. I heard about the Affordable Care Act, his work with climate change, what was going on in Libya. There was a lot of other things being covered too, but the economic recession was definitely a big part of that, and I'm just tired of hearing about it in general. So that was my least favorite thing about the book was just the amount of time that had to be spent on that because it's such a big thing. You can't really say this as a spoiler because all of these things happened, you know, in the public eye and people are aware of what he's talking about, but the book ended with the raid on the compound that Osama bin Laden was living in May 2011. And I thought that was a really interesting way to end the book because it almost read like a thriller. I actually felt myself getting tense listening to the story, even though I knew how it ended. I remember when Obama went on television on May 2nd, I believe, 2011, and told everybody that they had found and killed Osama bin Laden, and just the feelings that that brought. I like that it ended on that. It was such a big thing that happened during his presidency. I could definitely see the argument of why you wouldn't want to end on that, but it worked for me. This is definitely 4 stars. I'm still trying to decide if it's a little bit higher than that, but like this and the address book are very even right now in terms of who's going to take the #1 spot. Otherwise, I'm almost done World of Wonders. I should be filming my thoughts on that tomorrow, I imagine. And then the 2 books that I thought I was gonna have to buy, yeah, I bought them. So those will be here soon, and then I can finish off with those 2 books. Hello, it is now the next day as I predicted, and I have finished World of Wonders by Aimee Nezhukumatathil. Thank God that book was short because it was not for me at all. There was one essay in that collection that I enjoyed, but all the rest of them I found to be mediocre or just kind of bad. The book is made up of essays in which each title is named after an animal or a plant, a fruit, a natural wonder, just something from the natural world. And she takes something about that thing that she's writing about and relates it back to her life. It could be related to something from her childhood or something more recent now that she is married with 2 kids. The one essay that I thought was actually good and really impactful was the peacock essay. However, the rest of them were weak and the connections were just not really there. They felt like a severe stretch for what she was trying to accomplish. There was one essay that really bothered me, the octopus essay. To be coming from an author that obviously appreciates and admires the natural world so much, to have her write about an octopus and then tell a story in which she encouraged some of her students to go out looking for octopi and actually like bring one back to her, and then to handle it and to have it die. And that just really bothered me, that you would even handle it to the point where it died and you tried to put it back in the ocean and it was clearly gone. And just the moment that she talked about like looking into its eye as it was kind of wrapped around her arm, and she could kind of see that the color was changing and it obviously was going to die soon if she didn't put it back in the water. Why would you do that as somebody who loves animals? Take this octopus and actually physically hold it when you know it could pass away. I don't know. That really bothered me. I was reading some thoughts from other people after I marked the book as read on Goodreads, and I kind of thought about what I was gonna say, and there was at least one other person that I saw that mentioned that octopus essay specifically and how much it bothered them, so I'm certainly not alone in my interpretation of it. The other thing was that the essays really felt like they were all over the place in terms of the tone. She would start off an essay sometimes where she would be really enthusiastically talking about the animal or the insect, using exclamation points, sharing fun factoids about it. And then when she tried to relate it back to something in her life, it would often, the tone would change and it would become very somber and maybe dark and just depressing. And it felt like whiplash because the essays were a couple pages long. So to just have that roller coaster of emotions, but have it over and over again, I got really tired of that. She seems like the kind of person who should just write a book about animals, maybe a book for like a younger audience where she just talks about all these cool things about animals and insects and other natural things in our world. That kind of seems like one of the vibes that she was going for, and then the other one was more of that serious, reflective sort of poetry vibe. A lot of the times when she was ending her essays, it kind of felt like she was leaning into that poetry side of things when she was picking her last line or the last sentence. So yeah, there was just, the tone was all over the place. I didn't like that either. This is definitely at the bottom of the list right now. This would be like a 2 out of 5 for me. And even that feels a little bit nice, but I guess it isn't a 1. I feel like a 1 is too mean. I did like that one essay. I get what she was going for, but I think the execution was just not there. The other thing that I want to mention is I did get the 2 books that I ordered in, and I now understand why this book was $40 freaking dollars. It's because it's printed on this really nice photo paper and there's photographs in it and whatnot. So yeah, I was like, why on earth is this book $40? That explains why. So yeah, hopefully I like this. So 4 books down, 2 more to go. Pretty good. In terms of the actual timeline here, we're still at the beginning of March. And I think tonight I'll probably start Intimations and then I'll end with Just Us. 1 more down, 1 more to go. I've now finished Intimations and I realized that I kind of matched the cover right now because of the yellow cardigan. This is a black and white, but I've got like a gray and white thing going on here. Anyway, this was a very quick read, although I did split it up over a couple days. And it's a collection of personal essays that Zadie Smith wrote, it seems, between the beginning of March 2020 and the end of May 2020. I do really like the look of this edition. I spent a couple extra dollars just to get this one because I liked the way it looked. I liked the bright yellow spine, and the back says that the author's royalties from this edition benefit the Equal Justice Initiative and the COVID-19 Emergency Relief Fund for New York. So pretty happy actually that I went for this edition. Overall though, in terms of the content inside, there were some essays that I did like. I think the last real essay she had, which was it's called Postscript, Contempt as a Virus. I think that was probably the strongest essay of the bunch, and it might be why that was the last essay on the list, other than she did have some intimations at the very end, but they were just little tiny thoughts. They weren't actual fleshed out essays. So yeah, the first essay, Peonies, I read it and my mind was like, uh-oh, this is too artsy weird for me. I do think some of the essays had some good points in there, made me think a little bit. Some of them didn't really seem to fit with the whole early COVID lockdown vibe. It would seem like she was talking about something completely different and then she would try to tie it in at the end. And it was a little weak, but I kind of liked what she was talking about in those essays that didn't actually have to do with lockdown. So I wasn't too concerned with that. Those points in there that she was making or reflecting on were interesting to me, whether or not they were lockdown focused. This isn't like a top of the list book, but I feel like it met my expectations or maybe slightly exceeded them. The one review that I'd actually paid attention to on this book was very middling, 3 stars, so I didn't have particularly high expectations for how this was gonna go. I now have Just Us to read. It's right over there. It's just sitting there staring at me, waiting for me to start it. I'm still a little curious about how the structure of it is gonna play out. I flipped through it. There's pictures, graphs, there's little marks on the pages that might indicate a response that Claudia has to these stories and thoughts that the white people are sharing, but we'll see. Hopefully it works for me. My final book for the Octafinals Group A is complete. I'm happy to say that this went better than I was thinking it would. I had a similar situation with this book that I had with Intimations, where I read the first little bit and was like, uh-oh, I don't know if this is gonna be enjoyable for me at all. The first section in this was some poems, and that was, you know, it's not really my thing. Upon reflection and actually going back to the very first poem after finishing the book, it made a bit more sense to me. I could kind of get the flow and the feeling, but the other poems beyond that just, yeah, weren't really for me. So I think starting off with that was not the best in my case, but the rest of what's contained in here is mostly essays, and I really liked what this covered. It is a conversation. The subtitle says an American conversation, and sometimes the conversation is between you, the reader, and Claudia, and sometimes it's between Claudia and someone else who is often a white person. There's a lot of different things that are covered, but they all center around white supremacy and racism. Some of the topics discussed are very obviously connected, and then others are more subtle. And those more subtle conversations were the ones that I took a lot from, because it wasn't something that I had necessarily thought about or considered before. So this is a good book, I'd say, if you're looking to sort of expand your horizons a little bit. If you feel like you have a good baseline that you're already working from, this would be a good next step up. It does get a bit academic at times, but it's not too bad. There were definitely points where I struggled a little bit and had to read a paragraph twice to really get what she was saying, but more often than not, I was following along just fine. The structure with this book, because I wasn't quite sure when I picked it up what it was going to be like. So generally what it is we have chapter headings, but they're not quite chapters, section headings, essay headings, and you just have a blank page with the title of that section at the top. And then she will have the text of what she is actually writing, the essay portion, on one page, and then there'll be these little red dots, which may be kind of hard for you to see, but yeah, these little red dots, which correspond with something that she is then citing over here. So she'll say where that information comes from and give the sources. Sometimes it's a fact check, and something that's written in the essay she will then be fact checking herself, or something that someone else said that she's talking to. And I found that to be a very interesting way to structure a collection of essays, and there was definitely things in here that you could read if you wanted to get even deeper. Generally, the sources were fairly academic, as you can imagine, so they would probably be even harder to really digest for someone like me. But if you're kind of used to that more academic writing, or you have a lot of knowledge in that area, this could provide you with a lot of new sources to read. And there's a lot of pictures as well, which sometimes were very obviously connected to the text, and other times I was a little confused as to what they were. She didn't always reference them, and sometimes it'd be a picture of a person, and I wasn't sure if I was supposed to know who that person was, or if it was a picture that was just sort of illustrating a general point that she was making. Because of all of the pictures and things in here, this is absolutely a book that if you're going to read it, you're going to want to pick up the physical copy of it in order to get the full experience. If you listen to this on audiobook, you wouldn't be able to get all of these pictures, and I'm honestly not really sure how they would structure it with the fact check pages. So yeah, if you're able to, read this as a physical copy. I think because this sparked some new thoughts in me, I thought it covered a good range of topics. I generally enjoyed it. This is going to be higher up on the list. I think I have my final ranking in my head, but I need to officially write it down. Then obviously I'll share it with you. Since I've now shared my thoughts on all 6 books, let's jump to my rankings. So back on January 25th, when the initial groups were announced, I attempted to film a live reaction of me finding out what group I was going to be reading for, what books that was going to be. However, it turned into a hot mess, so I decided not to use that footage. However, there were 2 things that I said in that video that I want to quickly show here. The first is this. This is not my fave group for sure. There were definitely other groups that I would have preferred to read for. And the second, we'll see. And now that I'm on the other side of this and I have read all of the books, I have to say that my general feelings were not that far off. I think I had an overall slightly better experience than I was expecting when I initially looked at the books that I was going to have to read, but this Octafinals round was definitely overall weaker than my reading experience last year. So yeah, it just happens to be the books that I got weren't books that I jived with quite as much. However, there were still some enjoyable reads in this. It's just overall the quality I felt was not as strong. Now that I've said that, here are my official rankings. In the number 6 spot, this should be no surprise to you if you watched the entire video, I'm going to put Aimee Nezhukumatathil's World of Wonders. I only liked one of the essays. I found the rest of them weak. The tone was all over the place. Just generally not a great time. It's just not a book for me. At number 5 is Masha Gessen's Surviving Autocracy. This was another one where I struggled a bit at times, only because I was expecting one thing and got something else. With a title like Surviving Autocracy, you would think that there would be more about that kind of thing in the book, and instead it was more about Trump and his cronies and everything that they have done. I don't think it was published at the best time, and I don't think the title was a good fit for the book itself. Number 4 is Zadie Smith's Intimations. I think because I liked half of the essays in here and the other half I was either completely confused or could just take it or leave it, this one kind of falls more towards the middle bottom. This is marketed as a book of essays written during the first few months of lockdown and kind of what that means for us as human beings. And I did find that some of the essays were kind of weak in their connection to COVID-19. However, I did like some of the things that she was saying in those essays, even if it wasn't exactly what I was expecting. So there was some good stuff to be found in here, but overall it was still just fine. At number 3, I have Claudia Rankine's Just Us. I was worried about this book because I didn't totally understand how it was going to play out, but I was pleasantly surprised by how my reading experience went with it. There were moments with particular poems or certain more academic things that I struggled with, but I think overall I learned a lot from this book. I liked how it was set up, and it was just different in a good way. I mentioned this in my review of A Promised Land, but I was bouncing between the final 2 and I wasn't quite sure which one was going to end up on top. So I decided in the end to put Deirdre Masks the Address book in 2nd place. I do think maybe my expectations for this were a little too high, maybe because it was the only book in this group that I actually voted for. So I was really hoping that this book would be a 5-star read and carry the group for me, considering I wasn't that excited about many of the other choices. And it still was a good read. I mean, I talked about some stuff that I really enjoyed from the book and some cool things that I learned. However, some of the writing was a little too casual, and there was a lot of info that I think maybe took away from some of the other stuff she was talking about, but definitely still a good read, a 4-star read if you're interested in reading it. I still recommend that you do so. However, it just wasn't quite as good of a reading experience for me as Barack Obama's A Promised Land. I was a bit worried about this one only because of its length, and I didn't know if I was going to appreciate the amount of time that I had to invest in this book in order to read it. As I mentioned, audiobook is absolutely the way to go with this, and I had a really good time listening to this book. It was also the kind of book where I wanted to talk about what I was actually, in this case, hearing about with my boyfriend, with my sister, and just sharing those funny anecdotes or sharing sort of behind the scenes things that I had learned. And that's great. I really was surprised by how much I ended up enjoying this book, and that is why it's at the number 1 spot. Those are my official rankings for the 2021 NonFiction Octafinals. If you also read for Group A, I am very interested to know what you thought of the books and how you ranked them. Feel free to let me know in the comments below, or tell me if you made a video and I'll go watch it. If you read for another group in the nonfiction division, I would also be interested to know how your reading experience went, how you ranked your books. I won't be reading for the next round because I do like to take a little bit of a break, but I imagine I will be reading for the semifinals. So some of those books that you read, I might end up reading too at some point, so it's something to look forward to. As always, all of our links are in the down bar. You can go check those out if you feel so inclined. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you later.